So this is the final of 4 videos related to Chapter 4 of our open text that deals with moral theories that respond to culture. And we're going to talk specifically about care ethics. First we'll look at the origin of care ethics, and then we'll define the basic beliefs, and then we'll simply apply care ethics to a specific situation. To start that off, here's an example. So here's a question. So you have 4 people, 4 candidates for a job, and the question would be, who should you hire? And let's just say that it's just any typical office job or whatever. And so you see the backgrounds of one person is an MBA from Chicago, University of Chicago. She's got 15 years of experience and is a senior director. Another person is a PhD from Harvard and with 9 years of experience as an associate vice president. Another person has an MBA from Stanford with 7 years of experience as a data analyst. And then finally you have your stepnephew that has no experience. And so the question is, well, who should you hire? Well, of course, that depends upon how you approach this from a moral standpoint, right? And we'll answer that. Most people would say, well, you hire either the MBA from Chicago, who was the senior director with 15 years of experience. She probably has a lot of experience. Or maybe the Harvard PhD that was an associate vice president. Those both sound kind of good. And if neither of those will work out, then perhaps the MBA from Stanford with 7 years of experience. Your stepnephew, not so much. We won't even consider him. We just took his resume because our brother or sister asked us to. But we'll come back to that. So, in the history of moral philosophy, most of the people who we've looked at thus far in our class were all males. Aristotle, Kant, Mill, Nietzsche, Bentham, Rawls, Locke. I mean, we haven't talked about Aquinas or Hobbes. I mean, they're all male. And so there's 3 more modern females that said, we need to kind of consider ethics from a different standpoint. We need to kind of think about it from a feminine standpoint as opposed to a masculine standpoint. So Carol Gilligan, Nell Noddings, and Joan Tronto all wrote about what would a moral philosophy look like if we approach this world not from a masculine world that is very objective and lacks feelings and is kind of more of a combative type world, but what would happen if we approach this from a more feminist viewpoint of kind of almost like a motherly ethic or whatever. And when they kind of considered what a moral philosophy would look like, they came across these basic beliefs, and which we now know of as care ethics, the stream of moral philosophy known as care ethics that has these basic beliefs. Number 1, we need to recognize that we are dependent and interdependent people. That in society, no one is an island in and of themselves. That we are dependent on each other to live and function in society, and therefore we are interdependent. We depend on other people depend on us, right? And so that's just something we need to recognize. We also need to kind of give consideration to contextual details. We need to recognize that in some circumstances there may be vulnerable parties, there may be people who are in a position of power, and with those position of power comes responsibilities and so forth and so on. So we need to kind of understand the contextual details and recognize things like that. And therefore, when we recognize the contextual details, we need to do what we can to protect those who are in vulnerable positions. Because it's part of our moral responsibilities to protect the vulnerable when possible. And then finally they say that we need to determine how to safeguard and promote the interests of all those involved. So it's not about taking advantage of people. It's not about not considering your own viewpoints like altruism, but instead we need to kind of safeguard and promote the interests of everyone involved. And so that, in a nutshell, is care ethics. And so how do you apply this concept of being dependent and interdependent, understanding the contextual details, being vulnerable, and safeguarding and promoting the interests of those involved? So back to the question of who you should hire. So a care ethicist would say this. Well, first of all, let's restate the values. First of all, their values would say we need to recognize interdependencies, consider the contextual details, we need to protect the vulnerable and safeguard the interests of others. Well, how does that apply then in this case of who to hire? Well, the facts are this. So we have a family relationship, okay, which should be protected with our siblings and nephews. I mean, we want that to continue. That's one of the things that care ethicists say is we recognize these interdependent relationships and we should act in a way that furthers those relationships, right? And so perhaps one might say, well, we need to actually consider our nephew. Even though he has no experience, we have to consider the relationship that we have with our family. And we should value that. And so therefore he should have an opportunity to succeed, because in this situation he's very vulnerable. He has no experience. How does he get experience unless someone takes a chance on him, right? And so therefore perhaps maybe we're the ones that need to take a chance on him, a care ethicist would say. And because of that, they would assume this conclusion. Therefore, perhaps we should hire our nephew. Now, I've oversimplified it. One might argue, well, what about the relationship between the hiring manager and his or her employer, or maybe relationships with other candidates or whatever. But to kind of understand how care ethics might be applied, we would look at this and say, wait a second, we don't write off the nephew so quickly. We have to kind of consider his interests as well, and can also consider, is he a vulnerable party? It would be hard to argue that a PhD from Harvard, who is an associate vice president, is in a vulnerable position. I think he could probably easily find a job somewhere, but your nephew, perhaps not. So therefore, a care ethicist might say we need to kind of at least consider the nephew and perhaps even hire him for reasons already stated. So in a nutshell, that's care ethics. It's an ethic that says, wait a second, it's not about rules, it's not about virtues necessarily, it's about understanding that society is based on relationships, and we need to kind of protect those relationships and move them forward. And also, in doing that, we need to consider the contextual details and watch out for people who are in vulnerable situations and protect those vulnerable people and advance their interests just as much as anyone else's. So that's care ethics in a nutshell.